To address the Bay Area's housing
One. One, two.
Have we got this working? Oh. Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please? Could I have your attention?
I'm never quite sure if the mics are working, and I don't often require one. Well, good afternoon. My name is Joe Bankoff. I have the privilege at Georgia Tech of serving as the chair of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, named for the senator here, looking at the overlays of technology writ large and global problems. And that's a spectrum from weapons of mass destruction to global development, and in the middle, the operating system. And one of the things that we've been able to do is to bring to the campus a number of very distinguished visitors who have taken the role of part-time faculty, one of whom is Dennis Lockhart, one of whom is John Rice, one of whom is Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, one of whom is General Philip Breedlove. But it was actually Dennis's idea about a year and a half ago that Georgia Tech, with all of its expertise that in various pockets around on infrastructure, really ought to start focusing on what we could do to convene not another classroom, not a set of lectures, but people who really are dealing with various aspects of this problem beyond the classroom in a set of dialogue. So you will see this thing talking about Georgia Tech Strategic Infrastructure Dialogues. And welcome, this is the third in that program, and it will focus on smart cities. The one last fall actually focused on, okay, so how do we pay for all this, looking at the financing issues. And the first one was a priority setting. What's the sequence in which we ought to do these issues? We hope next fall to do one on the challenges of big infrastructure around water, dams, locks, levees, things you're reading a lot about in the news these days, particularly if you focus on the Midwest of the United States. So it's my pleasure to just sort of kick this off with my thanks to a bunch of people, most notably to Deborah Lamb and to Claire Engel, whom all of you have learned to get to know, who have basically organized this session on smart cities. I also want to give thanks to Invest Atlanta, which has contributed to this, to the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, who has contributed this, to the provost, to the Strategic Energy Institute here, to our colleagues in various schools who've all worked together to pull this together. And it is really an effort to bring into focus a real look at certain problems. But if you thought you were going to sit here and take notes, get over it. We really want you to be a participant. We will have panel discussions here, but the process is not one of trying to just take notes, although I hope good ideas will come out and it's not prohibited. But you should feel at license to raise your hand, ask questions, disagree, suggest other ideas, or has anybody thought about, because the range of people here are global. The perspectives of the issues are based on a very simple problem. Where you sit affects where you stand on many of these issues. And so understanding the complexity that we bring to this, technically, culturally, and politically, becomes an opportunity to really explore the core of the issue that we hope we will be able to deal with today. I want to recognize that we have representatives of elected officials from our congressmen. We have a number of municipal officials here. We have representatives of their staff. We have been very fortunate to have global participation, literally, and you will hear many distinguished speakers. But I really wanted to start by saying we're not here to admire the problems. We're here to talk about how we might address them. And so this is a safe space to say crazy ideas. It's a safe space to sort of disagree or what's wrong with that idea so that we have an opportunity to have a rich dialogue. And now on behalf of the university, let me allow the welcome from our Executive Vice President and Head of Chief Research Person, Dr. Jalki Abdullah.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shawi Abdallah. I'm the Executive Vice President for Research here at Georgia Tech. And on behalf of President Bud Peterson and other institute constituencies, I would like to welcome you to Atlanta and to Georgia Tech Smart Cities Dialogue on Building Inclusive Communities and Partnership event. I'm honored to be with you this afternoon to recognize the missions that bind us together and to express my own strong support for these efforts, and my excitement for the opportunity that our institutions and organizations can come together to create new and lasting partnerships and to share best practices and opportunities that I believe will have incredible and lasting impact on research, on education, and on the practice of smart and inclusive communities. I looked through the agenda over the next couple of days, and I'm going to be missing most of it, but I'm going to stay for the first one. But I thought it was remarkable. In attendance here are key national and international stakeholders representing government, as well as industry and academic leaders from around the globe. From my research colleagues here at Georgia Tech, who you'll hear from later, we have experts from around Atlanta, the state of Georgia, from the United States, but also many of you have traveled as far as Israel, Australia, Africa, and many places in between. We are thrilled to welcome you to Atlanta, and we hope you'll enjoy Georgia Tech campus in the city of Atlanta. I would especially like to thank and echo what Joe said, acknowledge our Smart Cities Dialogue partners, Newsweek, the Metro Atlanta Chamber, and Invest Atlanta. Thank you also for Midtown Alliance and the City of Atlanta for their local leadership. Georgia Tech is proud to be partnering with these partners and to convene these discussions, but also to continue to serve as a leader in this space. Let me also recognize Joe. Thank you, Joe, for service to Georgia Tech as the chair of Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, for his instrumental work in making this conference a reality. Joe is stepping down from his position as chair, but he will stay involved. He's promised to be with us for a long time. I'd like to thank him and congratulate him. And he will be continuing to help us as professor of the practice. This dialogue is generously funded by various interdisciplinary entities at Georgia Tech. Again, you heard from Joe acknowledging them, but I want to second his thanks to the Sam Nunn School, to the Strategic Energy Institute, and also Georgia Tech Professor of Education and the Schools of Public Policy and Civil and Environmental Engineering. Now, the dialogue is part of a series of such discussions that are sponsored by our Georgia Tech distinguished professors of the practice. John Rice, who recently retired as vice chairman of the General Electric Company, but he's back to GE, and Dennis Lockhart, the recently retired president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Thanks again to all of our external partners and to Georgia Tech constituents for making this event possible. We gather from near and far to exchange ideas and build strategic partnerships, and these critical discussions and touch points are made possible because of ongoing investments from our partners. Now, this agenda is filled with speakers, with panels and presentations that take smart cities out of theory and into practice. I'm repeating much of what Joe said, but we wanted this conference to be different, and instead of the traditionally vertical and discussions that are normally lectures, we want to talk about work on the ground and how each of these projects are making a difference in the communities where they are implemented. We're excited to show you what we call research in action around the main thrust of the dialogue that will include a number of my Georgia Tech research colleagues. Those main thrusts center around inclusive engagement, digital twin, resilient spaces, innovation district, and the future of robotics. The how of this ongoing research and these projects is also very critical. As researchers and practitioners, I don't have to tell you that there continues to be a disconnect in how these solutions are talked about, planned for, and eventually sometimes implemented. There have been great strides made all over the world, as evidenced by the work of those present with us today. But we must admit that no city has been able to find the right holistic mix of technology that serves the needs, wants, and demands of its citizens. I should say no city or community has done so yet. And that's why we're here today so that the scholarship and work will continue and collaborate together. The data that we can collect, and we are collecting, shows us issues of mobility, sustainability, and accessibility for aging and lower income citizens, among others, in our cities, in our towns, and our states. The data can also show us bottlenecks and delays. The data can show us large energy outlays and inefficiencies. It can show us persistent and recurring flooding. But there's something missing in that sort of data collection. What's missing are truly the opinions, the wants, and the needs of the citizens. And finding the balance between the well-being of our communities, their expressed wishes, and the proposed technological advances that might address them is why we are here. We want to frame the discussion around developing solutions to create smarter communities with the social ecosystem as the primary consideration. Smart technical solutions, while important, are secondary. To frame these discussions, we will discuss inclusive engagement, where all voices are heard, how smaller communities see themselves in the smart cities paradigm, how social and economic mobility and connections within larger economic regions should be discussed and addressed. One of the ways we're doing this at Georgia Tech is through leadership of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge. The challenge supports one-year projects to develop and implement smart design solutions to some of the biggest challenges facing the state. And it's a great demonstration of our continued commitment to the resiliency and vitality of the whole state of Georgia. We are nearing the end of our pilot year with the first cohort. The 4 selected localities, 2 cities and 2 counties, were chosen for the first cohort from a pool of applicants statewide, and they span from the coast of Georgia to rural communities and to the metro Atlanta area. They are focused on projects to improve local housing needs, address traffic and transportation challenges, and develop more targeting flooding forecasts of storms and sea level rise along the Georgia coast. Chatham County on the Georgia coast has only one official water level gauge, but the impact of rising water varies dramatically up and down the coastline. The impacted residents expressed a need for more targeted flood warning and forecasts. Chatham County is using its smart communities support to partner with Georgia Tech researchers to develop a sensor network that is coupled to data analytics for more accurate localized flooding forecasts for improved emergency planning and response. Residents are also excited to see that localized sensor data is being developed and will be visible to them. Our researchers are hearing a lot of thanks for doing this in my neighborhood, rather than simply taking the data and coming back with a solution from Atlanta. The project is a tremendous example of community engagement. Community and neighborhood groups are crucial collaborators in finding smart solutions that impact the needs of their own community. We also love the challenge because it's a true exemplar of the power of the potential of collaboration. It is interdisciplinary. It engages faculty, staff, and students from many of our colleges, our schools, our interdisciplinary research centers, and other academic units. And of that, we are very proud at Georgia Tech. This research model is distinctive and innovative in that the communities are paired up with strength areas of Georgia Tech. The researchers and professors, as well as the student participants, become true partners with the communities. They cement the collaboration between them and between Georgia Tech and the community itself, and they do learn themselves from those communities. Of course, there are other similar smart initiatives, but we are proud to have the Georgia Tech solution. While other universities provide advisors to communities all around the country in support of their smart efforts, our approach is to embed the best and brightest minds as part of the teams in the communities, and to create something altogether distinctive, creating powerful platforms and a model by which other communities may learn. All communities can be smart, but we know the key to long-term success is long-term engagement, relationship building, and a dedication to continuous improvement. The second cohort of communities will be selected soon, and we're waiting to see which ones will be selected in the same framework and the same philosophy. I'd like to thank you again for being here. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your time here in Atlanta and on the Georgia Tech campus. Before I go, I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's keynote speaker, Peter Hirschberg. Peter is an innovation advisor to cities and companies and has created 2 centers of urban innovation from scratch, including Maker City Project and Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. He's the founder of the Maker City Project, the national organization tasked with helping cities and towns reclaim manufacturing prowess by leveraging the Maker movement. His research on the Maker City is available in the best-selling book, Maker City, A Practical Guide to Reinventing Our Cities, funded by the Kauffman Foundation. The book was created in collaboration with the White House, where it was launched in 2016, and the Brookings Institution, where Hirschberg is an author. Peter, I thank you for being here today and for bringing your story and expertise to this dialogue. Everyone, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker. I don't think this is working, so now it is.
So before Peter speaks just briefly, we want to also point out one of the most strategic city relationships that we have among the smart city space is with the city of Atlanta. We are first and foremost at the heart of Atlanta, and Atlanta is kind of where our home is. And with that, I want to introduce a short welcome with Gary.
So good afternoon. My name is not Peter, and this will be the third welcome you receive, so I will be extremely quick. My name is Gary Brantley. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the City of Atlanta, started in October. First, I would like to thank Georgia Tech and all of the attendees and panelists who came from all across the world. So it's a very exciting time in the City of Atlanta as we are experiencing a surge in urban growth and visitors and businesses within the city. It's my guess that everyone in the room has tackled the topic of smart cities. What is it? What does it look like? Well, at the City of Atlanta, the goal is building a smart city to improve the quality of life by using data and technology to improve efficiency and services to meet the needs of residents. Technological advances create new opportunities for us to leverage data in ways that we've never done before. For example, we can use data in the City of Atlanta for street traffic, foot traffic, data traffic, as well as ensuring a safe and sustainable environment for residents and businesses. At the same time, the expectation of the city residents, visitors, and businesses are undergoing a massive shift towards greater demand for connectivity and immediacy. Advances in fiber, wireless, sensors, big data, analytics, and connected devices have created avenues for the City of Atlanta to meet those demands. We've taken a collaborative approach, which I'm very excited about, starting with our leadership teams, with the newly announced CIO Advisory Board, and our public and private media partners to help us achieve those goals. Atlanta is embracing innovative projects such as ATL Living Labs Text Challenge to establish a resiliency strategy centered around access to food. The city also won the Mobility Award for the North Avenue Smart Corridor at the Smart City Barcelona Expo in 2018. A delegation will be attending this year's Expo, me included, where we look forward to collaborating with all of our peers in hopes to continue to push the envelope on innovation. Lastly, Atlanta is a part of the 100 Resilient Cities, and as such, we'll be hosting the first Smart Cities Conference in North America in September with a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Together, these initiatives and benefits can help improve the quality of life for government services for the City of Atlanta. It's my hope that by using a citizen-centric approach, we will be able to successfully marry developments and technology with residents' needs. Again, I'm Gary Brantley, Chief Information Officer for the City of Atlanta, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
With that, let me welcome again Peter to come up and give our keynote.
Well, it's great to be back. I'm Peter Hirschberg, and I'm going to be talking to you today with a presentation that looks backwards and looks forwards. Here, have you found how to? Oh, well, okay. Well, you need the actual mouse. Yes. This is well, I don't actually have the actual mouse. Okay, well, while you're looking for the actual mouse, that's a, let's see, well, here, I bet if we just could use a keyboard too. If we hit the escape key, that would help us. Okay, you know, I used to run marketing at Apple, and this was the key thing we learned. No matter how far advanced you got, there was always something about presenting the slides. So clearly what we're having today is a wonderful connection back to the early history of computing. And it's interesting, so for many years, I was working on IT platforms. And when I went to Apple, we had to explain to people why they wanted the personal computer at first. Then we had to explain to ourselves and the world why we wanted our computers to communicate. And a few years later, I was running one of the first social media search engines. So suddenly the audience had a role. And we were at a moment where brands and news organizations were like, who are the bloggers? How come everybody's talking? And it was right around then that San Francisco opened its data. We were opening our data. And I realized that this act of opening data up was as transformational for the political or the governance realm as, in fact, social media was for computing. And this was around the same time that we started to actually see Internet of Things and, are we operating? Okay, Internet of Things and big data. And that's when, in my own world, I moved from a platform of computing to my favorite platform of all, the city as a platform, which is what I want to talk to you about today. This talk is called From Smart Cities to Cities That Dream. And first of all, I want to welcome you all to the 10th anniversary. Not the 10th anniversary of this conference, because it's the first one, but it was actually 10 years ago that the technology stack and the ideas that we're using to kind of put together inclusive cities and data were actually launched on the world, which is why this is a great opportunity to look back and then to ask what are our challenges as we move forward. Now, this actually happened in October of 2009 that Mayor Gavin Newsom in San Francisco, it was August 19, 2009, that in my hometown, Gavin Newsom opened up our data and created the first open data portal in San Francisco. It took me a few hours to go back in the records and get this. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and suddenly when this happened, it became an invitation. We threw some of the first events with Code for America and Hacks and Hackers, and we noticed if you open this stuff up, whole swaths of the community came in and started working on things. And this kind of began us. Now, not to be outdone, in New York City, Mayor Bloomberg, about 2 months later, fought back and said, well, you may have an open data portal, but we're going to give out prizes. We're going to give out prizes for apps if you come up with something. And our mayor, who's now governor, did not take to that kindly, and he fought back and said, we have an app store. We have an app store. And, okay, this then led to what we see as almost a race to innovation in cities. Very friendly competition among cities to start deploying and to share these things. And all this happened at a time when the principal technology platform of the day, Web 2.0, which was about 5 years old, started to be adapted to what we're doing in cities. Tim O'Reilly coined that term, Gov 2.0, and the concept was all of these open services that could be whipped together could build apps. I remember going to the first, to one of Tim O'Reilly's conferences, and it was the first time I saw the Google Maps API, and people saw the capability of what was possible there. One of the founders of Waze showed that to me. And it was in that same year also that IBM announced their Smarter Planet initiative, which to this day is probably one of the greatest marketing communications initiatives in this space. But it also set us on our current path. It said this is about efficiency, this is about kind of data mining across platforms, and in some central way, we can make our cities better. And in many ways, what we've begun to realize is it really isn't centralized. It isn't just about efficiency. It's about seeking new goals and solving a set of problems that didn't even exist back then. Because really, in many ways, today, we live in an era of consequence. Now, when I say we live in an era of consequence, the tech industry is being held accountable. We have a very kind of serious set of issues that we're solving from affordability and wealth concentration, including some that the tech industry created around privacy, around the effects of social media. And it wasn't always this case. When I went to work for Apple for Steve Jobs, changing the world was indistinguishable from doing good. We're going to change the world, and the world didn't much care because the tech industry was pretty tiny back then. But today, our work is completely central to the future, and we're being held accountable. So that kind of frames all of us in technologies and cities to kind of a higher standard. And you can see this in how the world is reacting to deployments out there. So this is an editorial written by the founder of RIM BlackBerry about his hometown, Toronto. And you know, Google, with great excitement, created Sidewalk Labs. And on some level, they a little bit fell into being the Robert Moses of smart cities, in the sense that it felt top down and it didn't feel as inclusive, even though they tried to do it. But then there's the whole set of issues we have today. Who owns the data? Smart cities for who? It's a trap. Now, you don't have to speak French. You don't have to speak French to know that when Lamont says, le concept de smart city n'est plus apparent, that there might be an issue here. And what this editorial says is, actually, the initial concept we all had isn't operational. It's not centralized, it's not top-down, it's very heterodox. And as much data as we have, do we really listen to what people have to say? Now, we have to listen to what people have to say, not only because it's a good thing to be inclusive, but politically, citizens have a pretty strong ear these days for technology that might be corrosive. This is what the elections and Facebook and everything's done to that. But if you want to win with citizens, you have to include them. And it's not just that there'll be a backlash. The city council will vote some other budget thing because it doesn't seem to be important. One of the people who understands this best is Jean Gell, one of the great architects from Northern Europe. But he's always been much more about how do you listen to and include the community. And he's made the point that as much data as we have, we don't actually use that for inclusiveness. So today, much more is expected of us. It's expected of people in smart cities because there's several things we have to do differently. One is we have to get out from silos, beyond City Hall. There's so many ways of including people, whether it's community projects or hackathons or inviting people in for open innovation. But there's kind of an instinct, if you're in a city, you're focused inward. And the question is, how do you get pulled out into that? Especially because we're being driven by ecosystems. Because there's so many players who can be invited in and should be. And and there's so many ways of designing with the community. This was the thing that stunned me at first when we first had our first kind of hackathon events in San Francisco. You would see artists and urbanists, software people, people from City Hall, all in communion working together. Now that stuff has to scale, but that massive inclusion is important. Gail had a great line. He said, because he's worked with a lot of cities, he said there was not a single city in the world that had a department for people and public life. He said cities knew everything about traffic, but nothing about how people actually use the city. And one of the questions is, are we solving mechanistically for one silo, or are we working kind of across the board in that? He said the moment that you start to get people visible and city life documented, you can start to plan and make policies in an integrated way. This leads to kind of a new way of thinking. In many ways, a lot of the smart city stuff's been very operational. We're putting in smart street lights, or we're going to evaluate traffic. But it turns out cities are very complex interactive systems, and you want to go beyond optimization to setting an objective function about how people are behaving or how the city works, and that's often very difficult. I'll give you an example. Rajiv Bhatia was the chief data guy for the Department of Health in San Francisco. He was the head doctor, like all the restaurant performance data reported to him. And when we opened our data, he noticed that certain housing projects were performing poorly. There was lead paint, people were getting sick. He's like, well, I'm the head doctor with data. I can see the data, people are getting sick. I better go enforce there. And he also saw traffic fatalities. So he started initiatives to work with the police to change traffic and to hold the housing people and real estate people accountable. And then he created a partnership with Yelp where he syndicated his restaurant data onto Yelp. And the mayor yelled at him. The mayor said, "You're not in charge of everything in this city, but you're suddenly trying to be in charge of buildings, restaurants, and traffic." And he goes, "Well, you know, health's a pretty integrated issue, and you can see all of this data." He was fired. He was fired because he saw in completeness the system nature of all this. Bureaucracies aren't really easily dealing with that, and yet that's the world that we live in. So it takes policymakers to start thinking, how do we move towards that kind of system thinking? And system thinking is also computational thinking. Once you start talking and sharing stuff around a model, you can do that stuff, but we haven't been as much. But given the challenges we have, that's a great leadership thing to do. Also, think about the changing priorities in the last 10 years since Smart Cities and Smart Planet started. I mean, when we started, when you add big data to anything, it's a startling how it gets 15% more efficient, like on the first afternoon. It doesn't matter if you're doing logistics or traffic or whatever, it is startling. But we have new problems today, right? We're now completely focused on things like the future of work and what is work, and also how do we train people. The cost of housing in the built environment, and all the economic resilient issues. You're seeing an economy where wages aren't going up because of automation, but cost of housing, cost of education, cost of health are going up. And when we wrote the book, The Smart City, the Maker City, people often said to me, this was based on work we did in the Obama administration. We worked with 100 cities, and we were just astounded by the developments that we're doing. But we reduced this to saying that Maker City is really a city that prepares its people for times of economic and technological change. That turns out to be, if you can solve for that, that's great. Another fundamental difference is I think the technology stack available to us today is kind of different than it was 10 years ago. We're still built on sensors and cloud and mobile. That's all the data stuff. But today we're adding very rapid developments in AI and machine learning, generative design, simulation. In a way, this is a co-intelligence. At its best, AIs are humans and machines in jazz, iterating quickly, seeing possibilities. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. I think we're often focused on the corrosive effects of AI. You go on Facebook and it leads to trolling or puts people out of work. We have to focus on some of the most amazing humane uses of it. And I would argue that when you look at the problems of cities, whether they're educational or the cost of building design or planning, boy, this stuff can make a difference. So some examples of this, let's talk about civic inclusion and ecosystems. So I mentioned that in this book, we kind of decided that preparing citizens for the future is a big deal. One point I point out is when we talk about ecosystems, there are civic institutions that can be transformational in the future of our cities. And these are institutions that may not even know it, but they're great. So, for example, we all know libraries have incredibly new roles as training centers, as community centers, as maker spaces. Arts organizations can be an amazing lubricant in both economic development, and we go into that. I want to talk about newspapers. We're doing a bunch of work with the McClatchy Group, which owns the Kansas City Star. Now, if you're a newspaper these days, you kind of have to get with the program because you're kind of old media. Young people aren't reading the paper as much. It's not as relevant. And newspapers are kind of famous for missing the big stories of the age. Like they missed Auto Trader and they missed Craigslist. Well, what's going on today? Clearly, it's the future of our cities, inclusion, the future of work. They didn't want to miss that. So the question was, how could the Star play a fundamental role in the ecosystem, the transformational ecosystem of Kansas City? So one thing we're doing is we're creating a new platform in the Star to elevate many of the civic innovation projects that go on, but 10 of us know about, to include the community in that, to get more people to work on them, to use a lot of the great stuff that's done, to kind of include the city in problem solving. And if you look at the NAV, we're going to care about entrepreneurs, we're going to inform people about the fourth industrial revolution, the future of work. We want to highlight the possibility of entrepreneurship and making, and we want to draw people into projects in the city.
Peter, what I would love for you to share with the group out there is just the important role that A civic institution like the Star plays in the reimagining of our communities, and really the opportunity that we have to help craft that narrative as it moves forward. I'm just, from an economic development standpoint, I see it countless times in what we do. We have the ability to help move our cities forward, and using our platform to do that is something that we need to continue to not only do, but look to grow and engage new audiences in so that we can further that mission.
So let me give you one example of this. We talked about open data as an invitation. Here's a sensor package. It actually comes from Barcelona. It has in it some of the most efficient air pollution, noise pollution, particle sensors. It's an open device. It costs about $100. Working with the Science Center, we're going to diffuse these into all of the schools. So we want kids to actually be doing these smart city experiments. This originated in Barcelona. And this is what happened when citizens got a hold of a sensor package in their city.
In the heart of bustling Barcelona, Plaça del Sol has become a popular place for friends to meet, relax and enjoy a drink or two. But I spare a thought for the residents who live here. For many families like this one, the noise became unbearable.
They go to buy drinks and beer, they go party, they sing a song a lot. And for me, at mornings, I'm very tired because I can't sleep good.
I open the window and say, "Shut up, please." And she says, "Sorry, sorry, sorry."
But the residents here have had some surprising help from this sensor technology made right here in Barcelona. By putting the sensors by windows and on balconies, the families were able to prove that the noise levels at night were reaching 100 decibels, far higher than the World Health Organization's recommendations. Armed with their data, the residents went to the council, who agreed to make some changes. Now the police move people on at 11 p.m, and new plant pots stop people sitting on the steps to drink.
It's more better because the people not sit down here in the place. Now we sleep a lot of the night and it's more good.
So that worked amazingly well there. And our belief is if you include people in a great city in all of this, you're teaching data literacy to kids. They know what a smart city is. And by the way, there's probably more will to implement this stuff in the city. Mary runs a youth center. It's an amazing place that starts kids making things at age 5. So we showed this to her. So here's kind of the reaction from the nonprofit and education community in that city.
I think the STAR with the Citizens in Science is really exciting because the idea that they're going to take data and kids are going to be collecting that all over the city and looking at the data. I mean, just if I were looking at it academically, how powerful, because it makes it really real. But then this idea of their ability to connect across the city, and they can start with that one and then build in others. So I can see that as something that will have a little bit of a chain reaction from that first project.
And of course, ecosystems, this is from our book, there's so many portions of the ecosystem one can draw into planning here, right? So we've got faith organizations, arts, education, makerspaces. So this is the people we get to draw on. And the private sector has an amazing role. Again, if you throw challenges out to entrepreneurs, amazing things can happen. This is Startup in Residence in San Francisco. So this is a global program we have where we invite cities in to give their challenges. The key thing about this is it's a very directed kind of project, and so things like this come out of it. In our airport, we did not have a very good way of handling visually impaired people, so we brought a startup in to do it. The key thing is we've kind of hacked the procurement system. Once you come into a program like this, you don't have to go, it is an RFP, so you don't have to go suddenly sell it to the city. You're baked in, there's an RFP, and you get to be considered. So we kind of collapsed a lot of that friction. Of course, when you invite entrepreneurs in to solve city problems, sometimes you'll get what you ask for. You'll get something disruptive. One of the biggest issues we have in the Bay Area is the cost of housing. It's a national issue. And on Mar Island, which is an opportunity zone, Factory OS has found ways to completely reduce the cost and build modules that can be stacked into apartment buildings, stacked into low-cost housing, or in the case of Oakland, the mayor asked for a lot of housing, and then the question was, oh my God, it exists, where do we put it? But this is an example of transformational technology for our cities.
To address the Bay Area's housing crisis, he is taking inspiration from Legos. KPIX5's Don Ford on the company making prefabricated apartment buildings that simply stack together.
In this building where nuclear submarine periscopes were once built, affordable housing is being assembled, but not in the way you think.
What's going on here is a lot of housing construction with a very different methodology. We're building the house more like you'd build a car.
The small apartments travel down an assembly line. First the floor is finished, then by crane it moves to the next station where bathrooms, walls, and ceilings are installed.
We can build it faster, we can build it more efficiently, with better quality control at a greater cost savings.
His bragging may not be too far off the mark. Google has placed an order for 300 of these units. Several buildings have been completed in San Francisco, and this building is being constructed in Oakland.
I personally like to call it unitized construction.
On the second half of the assembly line, the whole apartment moves on a cushion of air as it makes its way past plumbing, electrical, and finally, appliances. So this is what it looks like on the inside. Appliances already installed, the sink, stove, microwave. It honestly looks pretty much complete. So when it arrives at the job site, they just start stacking them together. Like giant Legos, these can be stacked up to 5 stories tall. And Factory OS says each unit cost $60,000 to build. On Mare Island, Don Ford, KPIX5.
So this is being used remarkably experimentally. Google, he mentioned, bought 300. I think it's up to a few thousand. They're setting some of these up in Alameda and putting a ferry in to get them to work. The mayor of Oakland commissioned these, and then the city council was fighting where to go put it. By the way, just to point out that these ideas aren't exactly new, here's a 1928 rendering by Buckminster Fuller. It's looking out over the perspective of a Dymaxion flying car over Treasure Island in the Bay Area to an accordion building structure that just gets raised up, because he was like trying to tell people you could do stuff cheaper and automatically and replicably back then. When I talk about cities that dream, I'm suggesting that goal-directed technologies can be applied to building or learning or even modeling for our cities. So here's one example of this. This is Van Ween. Van Ween builds housing in the Netherlands. So it's market housing, but it's less expensive. And yet they want to make it solar and they want to make it really good. It's prefab, but they have to solve for a number of problems. So they have to solve for what's the sight line, how much solar gain comes in. You have to solve for profit, but then also there's variety. All of this is put into a machine-based simulation and based on what they learn, and it comes up with tens of thousands of possibilities. These are things that would take humans and architects a long time to come up with. It allows people to both make better selections, but the key concept here is people want something better at a time when we actually have less. We have less energy, we have less construction costs, 30% of construction there's waste in all of that. So something like this that applies machine learning allows us to get a better result with less, which kind of satisfies up. That same kind of approach can be applied to how we learn, to accelerate human potential. So this is an Autodesk project. This is one of their design tools. And this guy is assembling a headset, and you see, it sees what he's doing, and watching him, it says you're a beginner. Then it begins to see he's more advanced, and it tells him these are the kinds of things that you can do. But it also realizes that perhaps there's a hole in his learning, and so it starts saying, here are other skills that if you learned them, you'd be more competent in this field. And then once it does that, because it learns what he's good at and what's needed in the marketplace, it starts teaching him, showing him other capacity. And then here are the professions. Here are the professions you could be aligned with if you knew this. So this is a machine learning system that looks at what I'm doing, begins to learn what I'm good at, sees kind of what I'm missing, and then can start matching me. So this was a research project that's being shipped. Let me introduce you to my friend Mickey McManus at Autodesk, who is working on some of this. I think this technology is amazing in kind of workforce development.
What if the learner's journey was more, I take a skill and this machine behind the scenes say, oh, you learn that skill, it opens up 5 more job opportunities. Oh, you learn that tool, it opens up some more. Oh, that tool, that team, and that place snap together into some new way that people haven't been able to model, and that opens up a ton of new possibilities. Sometimes we're going to discover stuff we haven't embodied yet. We're going to discover stuff that is too esoteric, and we don't know how to teach it. We might also discover new jobs that don't even have names yet, that are emerging jobs in about 3 years. What if we could be preparing for them right now? What if we could send that off to teachers and go, we need you guys to figure out a way to embody this into some kind of new curriculum, and maybe it's just students that do that. So it's a rethinking of saying there are learners that are human and there are learners that are machines, and we're going to put together high-performance teams out of them, and they're going to be improvisational. They're going to be more like jazz.
And this can be applied in many realms. We've seen it in kind of learning and design. We've seen it here in what Mickey's doing. Autodesk is doing this in their interiors. They have an innovation center in the Mars Center in Toronto, and they've instrumented it to understand how well are people collaborating. If people are less efficient, what form of building design or light or other factors might affect them. And the concept can even go to the point, imagine you'd have a neonatal unit. It's a room in a hospital that you're taking care of babies. If it's underperforming compared to other ones, maybe it issues an RFP and says, I need to be improved, right? So you can monitor those kinds of things. This can also be applied to how we plan cities. Goal-directed design in cities where we say, here's what we're trying to achieve, how do we do that? So this is a project that we're collaborating with MIT City Science Group on. It's called Cityscope. And so the concept here is, what if we could take a physical model of a city, and then as we make changes, we could go through and in real time, computational models start showing us what kind of outcomes we would get. So here's a specific example of that. This is, so MIT's in Kendall Square, which is known as a big innovation community because there's a lot of startups that come out of it. And you can see these are the things that Cityscope manages. As you move those Lego pieces around, it starts changing things like, are we optimizing for third place or building efficiency? Or are we optimizing for access to parks? One thing you realize is that Kendall Square is great at a couple of things, but it's not actually, doesn't have that much culturally going on. It's not that inclusive, whereas like Harvard Square, which is more city-like, is. So one can use something like this to collaboratively plan what a part of town looks like. Technically what happens is the Legos have optical codes, so as you're building these things, the camera's looking down on them, and as you're working on it, in real time things change. If you increase the density or you increase the height, allowing more affordable housing in, what happens to employment? What if we move from bicycles, or what if we put bus rapid transit in? So it literally allows simulations on kind of all of these factors. And it also becomes very inclusive because you've got different parts of the community engaged in planning it. Something like this is, it turns out in Asia, they kind of eat this up because they're planning cities. In the United States, we have fewer new cities, but as we see with opportunity zones, like 26 popping in Atlanta, tools like this can be amazing. It also has an interesting effect on inclusiveness, this whole human dimension. This was Hamburg. Hamburg was expecting the 2024 Olympics. They didn't get it. What they got was a bunch of refugees. So as the refugee crisis hit Hamburg, the question was what to do, and they created a Cityscope instance. So in this case, they didn't have opportunity zones, but they had little black squares. So they started looking at what part of town might we design with new forms of employment, new forms of housing, kind of building up an ecosystem around new residents, right? So this then led to community collaboration that as they move these things through, a bunch of the planning and costs and development and, assumptions were put in, and it allowed them to plan more rapidly and at scale how to do it, but also much more collaboratively because everybody was working on it. One of the interesting things was if you were obstreperous, like you were against this stuff, it was very tough to be against a model. You'd have to sit in a chair because the game was go make something that works. So you only got rewarded if you came up with something. This then led to, it actually led to a set of plans. The mayor became particularly successful in German politics because it worked. Atlantic wrote it up as a great experiment. And yet here's the one thing that was missing. This was a planning exercise, and there's something about planning. It's like you're planning and then you're done and you go home. The architects leave, it's done. But of course, these days we can instrument and constantly go on. So a program like this could be used for ongoing ways of achieving a more inclusive economy. When we want to solve problems like keep wealth within a system, not extracting it, or reward people who are contributing externalities like they're creating art, which normally we can't reward because how would you? And yet if you can measure it, you can do things like get more value if you're living and working or shopping locally, or if you're doing volunteer activity. And this could be accomplished through tokenization or local currencies. There's many ways of doing it. And we're sitting palpably on a moment where there are both new financial tools and new ways of doing this where you basically can come up with this. You could take this as far as algorithmic zoning, where instead of zoning being set, you're trying to solve for a neighborhood and things adjust. It's a new way of thinking, but it's system thinking. You're probably thinking, okay, those are cool demos, but there's a mayor in my life. When I go home, what am I supposed to say? You know, one of the questions is, how do we get our cities to dream like this? And where would we start experimenting at scale to do all these interesting things? And then, okay, that's great. Who's going to pay for all of this? So what we're really asking is, I'm describing some new frontier in America. Where is that? And we kind of have this happy accident right now. We have this happy accident that's kind of the birth child of a Republican desire for market-based solutions and kind of a progressive democratic desire to help our cities that then popped out as this Opportunity Zone program, which, if it works right, brings a few $100 billion into our cities, right? And there are 8,700 of these in 50 states. So we're talking about 31 million Americans. And the interesting thing is that's probably 100,000 experiments. And the way that Opportunity Zones work, you have to do it soon. If you start a fund, you have to spend it you have to start within half a year. And actually, to get the most benefit, you have to start in 2019. So it's like a starting gun is going off for essentially experimentations practically at the rate of China. And the wrap on these things is, it would be great if we only knew what we were doing. So it's either going to be a big tax break that leads to gentrification, or it could be completely transformational. And we know what we're aspiring to here. And what I'm suggesting is all the stuff that we've been leading up to about goal-directed planning and inclusiveness, boy, do we have a place to try that in America in the next few years, right? What we want are economic development, local ownership, local businesses, community infrastructure. We don't want to just have market rate things that make people leave the community or build something up, but don't build up an economy. And the stories that we tell ourselves, so all of us in the city's world, the press, the story that we tell ourselves about what we're building here is everything. Because if we tell ourselves this is the story of perhaps the greatest opportunity to build something since the New Deal, we may get that. I kind of started the talk about saying we were at a frontier again. America loves a frontier story. This is kind of our founding story, right? And by the way, our country is great when it hears about a frontier. John Kennedy tells us the new frontier. Reagan talks about City on the Hill. And these are the moments that we move forward. If you have a president who tells you everything's closed and just hunker down, people get kind of grumpy. So it's important that we kind of believe in and tell ourselves these stories. And you kind of know when you're a frontier. I mean, look, the map's the same. It's still the same landmass. But everything in it's changing. What work is changing. We're repopulating also, right? We move people out through urban renewal. People are literally moving back. We're literally rebuilding. This is a frontier to discover. And in many ways, it sets kind of a mission and a way we can measure ourselves. So I would argue that these opportunity zones, at least in the short term, is where America is going to go to dream. They're an experimental frontier. Well, why? Because they have, there's like lower risk because you're dealing in a part of town that has to get redeveloped. There's less regulation, more regulation in California, New Hampshire, none, but Atlanta's a very friendly place to a lot of the stuff. And capital's a bit less expensive. And you can also put multiple capital types together here. To pull this off, this really needs goal-driven leadership. It needs everything that we're doing and we're about to do to be inclusive and to deploy. And there are, 8,700 of these in America, in all 50 states. Atlanta, I think, has 26 opportunity zones, but they're throughout the place, and there can be great collaborative, I think, network learning among and across all of them. So we have kind of a free market, free for all. It's kind of whatever the market decides. It'll be, the guardrails will be put on by the work that we do, the planning that we do. And so how do we manage all these things all at once? Well, much of the stuff that we've been talking about today that applies to education, that applies to building techniques, and applies to city planning, I think can be applied here to make things inclusive, to bring in new financial models. This was a stack that I wrote and that I'll leave you with. Because I think this is also kind of a set of what our challenges are. When you think about something like an opportunity zone legislation, the first thing you think about is real estate. It's real estate developers, right? By the way, if this looks like a 7-layer network stack, I apologize, I kind of grew up in computer networking, so everything looks like that, right? But in fact, hardware is on the bottom. Real estate and placemaking is on the bottom. There's this whole layer of data analytics and machine learning, I think, that can reduce risk, bring communities together, help us plan in new ways. So I hinted at that, but I think this is a very important integrated part of how we approach the world. Financial innovation. There are a lot of new, rent-to-own, fractional ownership, local tokenized economics that can keep economies within a system. This is a whole new arena for exploration. It's kind of a bit at the leading edge of it, although some of it is as old as community ownership and co-ops. But that piece of financial innovation, which you can see a lot of startups since the financial crisis are focusing on, that's key. Locally owned infrastructure. So whether this is broadband or green energy, not only does this fit, but they're great opportunity zone projects because it's infrastructure, and you can actually design this so that the investors get paid back within 10 years and the community owns it. And we're aiming at more community ownership. That's inclusiveness. Communities could own housing, they could own businesses, they could own infrastructure. You want them to own more because you'd be better off. The next line is all about local business and entrepreneurship. Talked about training workforce development, right? If you can change the economics of that, especially when learning is going on and on and on, if the purpose of a city is to keep people prepared, that's great. And the top one, healthy communities. John Ressant can tell you more about that later, but a lot of the work that is going on in the smart cities world is now increasingly looking at health and happiness and measuring, because if you can measure and solve for that, especially in an era of, kind of general dissatisfaction with what technology has done, that's pretty important. So as we wrap up, here we are 10 years into the modern smart city movement. There's been an amazing technology stack deployed, and yet we know we need to do more. We broadly need to be more inclusive. We also have great new tools coming on and a new set of challenges that sets, I think, a pretty clear agenda for everybody. So kind of some of the calls for action and all this. Well, first is there's a lot of civic capacity in institutions that we aren't even aware of, but we got to invite them in. This is, I talked about newspapers, we know about libraries, arts organizations. I did a convene at the Annenberg School where I'm a senior fellow on that. Secondly, private sector and innovation is a big part. I think using opportunity zones as an experimental canvas is great. And finally, we'd love to collaborate with you on all of this. We're at makercity.com, and I want to thank you all for inviting me because we've got a great 10 years ahead of us. Thanks.
We have some time for some questions.
Oh, good.
Since this is a full house, but actually a very intimate and selective crowd, when you raise your hand to ask questions, please introduce yourself. And a couple more notes is that we're being live streamed by Newsweek right now, so your question will be heard all over the world. So, and your answer will also be heard, so no pressure there.
And hello to our global audience.
Yes, global audience that is. And we'll ignore the MIT example in this room, but please ask.
Tom Sorsher from Jet Propulsion Laboratory. You mentioned Barcelona.
Yeah.
How is the U.S. doing, and how are some other countries that are perhaps even more innovative than we are doing in this case?
So this is kind of like comparative internet. Yeah. Yeah, well, the amazing thing is how people interpret the stuff differently. I did this book on Maker City. It was interesting to see how different cities were even interpreting getting citizens engaged. Barcelona went through a really interesting experience. They were kind of a big leader of the whole mechanistic smart city side of things, and they had their big conference. They had new leadership come in that was much more I don't know, it's like much more Bernie Sanders-like. So it was less big corporations, more inclusion. And so they have interesting experiments going on. The people who made that sensor package have created something called Fab Cities Global. They're looking at, over 40 years, how can we have much more locally produced product content, food content, energy content, even local currencies, right? And that was a little bit in reaction, I think, to the economic crisis in Spain. So I think they're pretty far ahead thinking about those kind of quality of life issues. I think in a place like San Francisco, as innovative as we are, we're also kind of a little bit of a tea party of the left. It's very difficult to get people to agree on new things. For example, our city council unanimously today voted to ban all forms of facial recognition in a city. Now, you could do some pretty corrosive things, as China has done, but you probably want to actually think about how to use the technology. So, look, and then you have Asian cities. Anybody that has kind of an autocratic ruler, or even a benevolent one like Singapore or Korea, Dubai, right? They're moving way ahead of this stuff. But I think the political tensions that we see of trying to mediate all these things, in a way, we'll probably be in the leadership of people that have better democracies are going to be in the more leadership on the humane side of this.
One more question.
Akia Sims, Department of Aviation, City of Atlanta. My question is thank you. My question is, actions typically speak louder than words, right? So has there been a study or an analysis based on what people say they want and what the edge data is actually saying that they really want? Are there actions being exemplified through data contradicting what people say they want?
So I think the question is, when people deploy projects, how much are they aligned with what people say they want? And kind of related to that is the things that people say they want, the things they really want. One of the, Steve Jobs used to point out that if Henry Ford asked people what they wanted, they'd just get a better horse. I think this is kind of where, this is one of the reasons where prototyping and experimentalism and participation comes in, right? So a project I didn't show here is when we were redeveloping Market Street in San Francisco, we took a whole bunch of that space and we asked the community to program it. We suppressed the city planning law so you could put up temporary structures and sell food and have electricity, and kind of freaked out all the OSHA people. But we had 50 structures that came up and we measured them, and they were actually reflections of what citizens wanted, right? So the idea that you could experiment and let people try stuff out, that's also kind of like the deploying the sensors with the kids in Kansas City. If you let them come up with it and then you see what are they going to work on, where's the research done, you'll be surprised. So look, I think it's certainly the case that a lot of smart city projects, nobody asked anybody, right? It was like the mayor talked to IBM or whomever, and the IT person in the city, and then money was spent. I think part of this, the way to do citizen inclusion is to include them in the process, and it isn't even a study, it's actions. Did that get it? Yeah. Thanks.
So thanks to Peter for really laying the groundwork in terms of what we see about smart cities now and into the future. And up next, I want to invite our first panel to come up and kick off, really further cementing, I think, Peter's thought leadership in this in terms of on-the-ground practice and research in many different sectors and many different ways. So, John, I'll have you come up and invite your panel.
Okay, panel, please join me. Do we have enough seats here? Good to see you. Oh, I'm going to be up here. Okay, good. Okay. I have to stand. I'm the chairman of the New Cities Foundation. We're a global nonprofit organization based in Montreal, Canada, and we look at the future of cities around the world, and we work with the private sector and the public sector. We very deeply believe that the future of our cities and the health and the dynamism of our cities really relies in a very healthy partnership between private and public. We're very focused on the impact of technology on cities, and I just want to, Peter, that was really terrific talk, and what you're doing is very, very important, and we certainly support it. So the opening panel here today is on the new paradigm in smarter cities, building smarter communities. And I think it goes a little bit to what Peter was talking about. This is this move away from the top-down, centralized approach. When we started out at New Cities Foundation 11 or 12 years ago, smart cities were on everybody's lips. And the paradigm then, as you may know, was it's a very centralized approach. It was elaborated by the likes of IBM and Cisco and General Electric and Siemens. And the idea was that cities could be smarter by spending lots of money and having sort of a single operations center. And the kind of big model for this was the operations center in Rio de Janeiro, which was sort of copied in various ways around the world. And the problem was it didn't really work that well. It was very, very expensive. Very little transparency, tended to favor wealthier parts of the city where you could sort of safely put sensors and cameras and things like that. And it really didn't go to the heart of what was happening in a city like Rio or other cities around the world, which is where you had real dysfunctions in governance, you had real problems of equity, et cetera. So without further ado, we have a great panel. You can read everybody's biographies in the book. But what's interesting about our panel, I think, is that it's very international. We have Australia, New Zealand represented, Africa, Uganda, and of course with Amazon and Dassault Systèmes, you have very big global important companies who are looking at the city space. So without further ado, I want to start actually with you, Dean Marsh from Dassault Systèmes. He's in charge of Dassault Systèmes business in North America. For those of you who don't know, Dassault Systèmes is a really interesting company that is a leader in sort of visualizing data. It's a software company, and more and more Dassault Systèmes has been looking at the city space, and we'll learn about that. Dean, when you look at cities around North America, what are you seeing? What trends are you seeing in your business? Perhaps we could start the conversation like that.
Okay, great. So thanks, John. So first off, for those of you who don't know about Dassault Systèmes, a little bit about where we come from and how we got into this space. Our heritage goes back to the aircraft industry, and we created the software that was used to design aircraft. So now today, almost every aircraft flying, Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, is designed using our software. We then extended that to automotive industry, so about 90% of the cars on the road are designed using the software. And so you think about the design of a car or an airplane, and you have the physical systems, the electronic systems. You have to measure the airflow in and around the car, the noise and wind resistance and so on. And so now you take that process and the ability to simulate and design, and you scale that up, and you can scale that up massively to the scale of a city. And so we can look at the physical structure of buildings, the fluids running through, the water and the sewer, wind flowing around the buildings, and noise levels like you saw in the earlier clip around, in Barcelona. So we can measure those things. And so as we've been doing that, we've been working in partnership with cities around the world to study this problem of where smart cities are going. Most notably, the work we're doing is with Singapore, Digital Singapore. So we've completely modeled the city of Singapore 3D digital mock-up or, digital twin. So we virtualized the city of Singapore. And what we're finding is that, as you heard in Peter's talk, cities are interested in how they plan, for the future. And the digital twin, you saw in the video, the Lego blocks, but what we've done is virtualize that in software. So, and where that's really useful is in what if scenarios. So what if I put a park in this space? What if I route a turnpike through here or change this street or, make some other change? What we do is provide a platform that enables both the planning, the what if scenarios, but also the engagement by the community. I think you heard in Peter's talk how important it is to have citizen and community engagement. So you can make a proposed change, have the citizens see it, vote on it, react to it. So what we've also found is that, cities are dealing with a lot of problems, density, traffic, and things of that nature. And it's, I think you also heard in Peter's talk, he touched on a lot of subjects that we're dealing with is it takes a lot of different departments in the city to deal with any particular problem, whether it's first responders, whether it's emergency management, whether it's, architecture and planning, zoning. So how do you bring all of those departments together? How do you get these entities within a city to break out of their silos and work together? So collaboration is also at the heart of what we're doing. And so, what we're finding is that, it's a very complex set of ecosystem that goes into understanding how a city's working, planning for the future, and integrating the new technology. So we found that, we're working and planning on the technology that's available to us today, but then how do we integrate technology of the future? So we start looking at autonomous vehicles and how do you introduce those into a city. So these are some of the trends that we think are driving this whole Smarter Cities topic. It's how do you get the city to think forward, engage the citizenry, and plan for the future.
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted to turn to Jennifer Musisi, who is here from Kampala, Uganda, the capital of Uganda. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And I learned also quite recently that it's generally considered to be the quality of life in Kampala is one of the best in Africa, in East Africa, certainly. And it's been voted that. And you're in this country at Harvard as the first city leader in residence of the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. So we'd love to know more about that. But from the perspective of an African city like Kampala, how relevant is this conversation? Do people in Kampala talk about smart cities, or is it relevant to people's lives? What do you look at? And of course, Jennifer, I must add, was also the mayor, the city manager of Kampala. For how long were you?
7 years.
7 years. Good. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the statements made at the beginning of the conference was where you sit determines where you stand. Where we sit as a developing urban center is a position where there are a lot of things that we don't have. But when we took over administration in 2011, we decided to focus not on what we don't have, but what we do have. We have a very young, intelligent, educated population in Uganda. We also have a lot of cell phones, mobile phones all over the country. I think right now the statistics are over 75% of the population have access to mobile phones. But we also had a city, 5 million, close to 5 million people, that was in need of infrastructure, in need of service delivery, in need of healthcare services sorted out, in need of education, in need of traffic control, and a host of other things. And in order to finance these needs of the city, we needed money. We needed to up the revenue of the city. So we took up the task of using technology to improve service delivery and therefore focus on the needs of the people and see how we could move forward in meeting these needs. The system that was in place was mostly manual in terms of revenue collection, mostly manual. The databases were very disjointed, very poor and old technologies, very vague collection procedures, and a very narrow tax base, coupled with very low compliance levels, as you can imagine, and a lot of revenue leakages. And as a result, the city could not finance a lot of its needs. And we therefore set out to build a system as the beginning of the Smart City Initiative that would help us to enhance revenue to meet the needs of the citizens. So we built a system which we codenamed the eCity system. And in this system, we were able to use the young people, use the mobile phone providers and their platforms, and use the handheld gadgets that so many people had access to. And were able to reform the revenue collection system to help it meet the main tenets of a good revenue collection system, in that it was now simpler, it was flexible, it was efficient, it was transparent, it was fair, and it was also convenient. That meant the citizens could now pay their taxes more conveniently and therefore increase the compliance levels. In building this system, we built a taxpayer database. We're now able to know how many people were eligible to pay taxes. We're able to set up this transparent system. We're able to effectively bill and collect taxes. We were able to use the SMS platforms on using people's phones, and were able to send assessments, send reminders for tax collection, receive payments using their mobile phone platforms, in addition to using electronic banking, but most people use mobile phones. So we're able to collect taxes using mobile phones. And it also facilitated our monitoring compliance of taxes, and therefore being able to penalize, to persuade, and to communicate to people that were not paying their taxes. This convenience increased the compliance levels. And in about 7.5 years, we're able to raise the revenue by about 200%, well over 190%, coming from, on the average, about $8 million annually to $22 million most recently. In collecting this revenue, we're now able to meet the needs of the citizens where we had first started, because we had started by identifying the needs, and then we're now able to meet a lot of these needs using the increased revenue and therefore increased compliance, because we're able to communicate to the taxpayers and say, look, out of the taxes we are paying, you're able to have hospitals. So we put hospitals, we put free medical care, we improved the schools, we improved the infrastructure, we improved the lighting of the city, and also some other initiatives that we took. How did we communicate to the taxpayers? Again, using the data that we had and using the network that we had built, we're able to set up social media platforms. We have 8 social media platforms. Ugandans are very strong on social media. So we use the social media to communicate on taxes, to communicate timing, to communicate projects, and to communicate the benefits of people paying their taxes. Subsequently, we're able to use the same system and use the same data to be a basis for doing a lot of other good things in the city, like revaluing the property electronically in the city, building other add-ons like payment for medical inspection, advertising fees, and all the other municipal taxes that were originally collected manually, and therefore widened our communication campaign and also built facilities like client call centers where people could now call and give feedback, ask questions, and get information from the city. So what we are doing eventually and what we've built on is building a smart city in its basics, but focused on the needs of the citizens and how best to meet those needs. So in building the system, we're able to increase revenue and then meet the needs of the citizens. So everybody benefited eventually. And as I've said, the system has been very successful, and it has been adopted by other urban authorities within Uganda as well as outside Uganda, and continuing to grow and provide other add-ons. Right now, the team is beginning to look at building things like smart parking that people hadn't heard about before, and lots of other benefits to the city. So smart cities are relevant to Africa, but have got to be contextualized to what is available, what the needs of the citizens are. And those needs are different from the needs of, say, cities and urban centers in the West or in the East. And that is eventually brings us together to form platforms that we can use to connect internationally, connect locally, and benefit the people and citizens in our urban centers.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I mean, one of the great things about cities, it seems sort of almost useless to say, is, but it's where things happen. And things happen in a very real way compared to, often on the national level where there's paralysis, inaction, poison, whatever you want in Washington or in other capitals. And this is also true in the field of climate change, where we see really inaction in Washington under the present administration, but very courageous action by cities. Last week in Los Angeles, where I live, Mayor Garcetti unveiled the sort of new climate deal for Los Angeles, which commits the city to radically reducing carbon emissions over the next 2 decades, in line and more with the Paris Accords. I was just a few days ago in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the capital of Saudi Arabia, where they're going to plant 7.5 million trees over the next 5 or 6 years, which should reduce ambient temperatures by about 2 to 3 degrees, which makes a lot of sense in the summer in that city, I can tell you. But on this point, I want to call Jason Whittet from the Rockefeller Foundation. You're the associate director of the 100 Resilient Cities program, which precisely that. It aims to make cities more resilient. I think someone mentioned that Atlanta itself has been the beneficiary of this program in a very real way. So I'd like you to talk a little bit, Jason, about your work and about how you approach these issues.
Absolutely. I kind of felt like that question was coming my way. First, let me just thank Claire and Deborah for putting this on. There really isn't a city in the world that wouldn't love to be having this type of hyper-local conversation about the future of the city. And then one other thing I just want to say, how many people here are work or affiliated with the university? So what I want you to think of, you are essential stewards. Whatever the future of Atlanta becomes, you are key to it. Administrations will come and go. Hardik can tell you the average CIO tenure in a city is something like 24 months, but they say tenure is forever, right? So you guys will be here and working, and I think it's very much incumbent upon you. I know of no successful city anywhere in the world that does not have strong, vibrant relationships with its centers of learning. So think about that as you go forward, and all of you are ambassadors. Let me answer your question by answering your first question. I think cities over the last decade have done a lot of introspective looking. With the advent of data, open data, advanced GIS, all of these things, being able to understand what's going on in your city has helped people understand what they need to do to be more successful, more resilient going forward. And I think every city now has a better sense of what we call shocks and stresses. So shocks are the big cataclysmic things, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, the things that can completely change your city in an instant. Stresses are the things you live with every day, failing infrastructure, air quality, maybe crime, lack of social cohesion, the things that make it much more difficult to live and to work and to succeed in your city. And so one of the things, as we look at the work that cities are doing on climate change and resilience, that I think has been missing from the conversation so far is a sense of urgency. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets for 2030, and you go forward, there will be cities in the world that will fail. Maybe they will run out of water, like Cape Town or Sao Paulo or other cities. Maybe they will suffer a cataclysmic event. Jakarta is in the process of perhaps moving because it's both sinking, subsiding, as well as being attacked by rising waters. Or perhaps it just will fail to tackle some of these issues. So I think the key thing is to figure out what cities need to do, and the cities that succeed will be the ones that spend money today, spend time today investing in tomorrow. And as we all know, that's really hard to do. If you look at maybe the National League of Cities or some of the other research that comes out about what mayors and city managers and top officials are thinking about, their number one thing every single year is economic development. And then behind that is infrastructure. Technology is either at or near the bottom every single year. So how do we kind of change some of these conversations to get people to invest in that infrastructure, to make some of those decisions that may not help them today, but are going to set them up for success down the road? So I think it's that sense of urgency that I feel like is the most important, and those cities that grasp it are going to be the ones that are in the best position in 2030 or 2050 or however you want to frame it.
Although geography also is destiny, and it depends on, whatever you do, let's say in Miami, it's going to be a difficult slog in the years ahead.
It is, and I mean, Miami is a Cat 5 storm away from being in dire trouble. The insurance companies will likely pull out, and that sets a bit of a disaster. So,
right. Well, on that cheery note,
no, it's not all that bad. It's not all that bad.
You shouldn't say it's not all that bad. Hardik Bhatt, you've had an amazingly impressive, long experience dealing with cities. I mean, you're original Mr. Smart City. Since I think we first met years ago. You were CIO of Chicago, CIO for the state of Illinois. You worked with the Smart and Connected Communities program at Cisco for many years, which we've been very close to institutionally. And now you're, of course, in charge of the digital government business at Amazon Web Services, or AWS. I'm not sure, what to call it. Hardik, what I want to ask you is about the whole kind of new world that you work in of cloud computing, cloud-to-edge computing, 5G coming here. What is that going to mean for some of the things that we're talking about, for the making communities smarter, making cities smarter, more adaptable, et cetera?
Thank you very much, John. First of all, it's great to see you. After a couple of years, I think, it was great partnering with you at Cisco. Thanks, Deborah and Claire, for getting me out here. And I was very energized listening to what Jennifer and the team are doing in Kampala. It's amazing. I think that's basically what is happening. So as John was alluding to, I've been in this area for about a decade now. Started all the way back in 2008, 2009, when we had the BTOP grants, where we were supposed to use the technology funding for improved fiber access, education, etc. And that time I was with City of Chicago, and we utilized about $64 million that we got from the Obama administration to put more education opportunities in the communities. And then went ahead and led the global business development for Cisco Smart Cities. Now, when I was in Chicago or Cisco, compare that to when I was in the state of Illinois about a year and a half ago for about 2.5 years, and now at Amazon. Smart cities have changed fundamentally. Like if you think about the question that John asked, how does cloud, 5G, and all of these technologies are impacting smart cities? I think at the fundamental, point, it is no longer about technologies. So I remember when in my days of Cisco, we used to go out and say, hey, this is the great shiny technology. What's your problem we can solve? And the answer was, okay, put sensors on the street lights or sensors on the bus stops or buses. And hey, suddenly now you've got a connected corridor and you can start extracting data. But then the things basically stopped there. It's like, what do we do with this? Because what you're doing by connecting all of these disparate assets that the cities have is creating a newer source, newer stream of data. But what happens to all of the petabytes of data that you already have? That is about the citizens, about the services that you provide to them, about the historical trends that you have, and everything that you have. So when I hear something like what Kampala is doing, is they're starting from the citizen. They're starting from what are the pain points of the citizens that they want to solve. And for them, that's step one of becoming a smart city. So when we think about smart city or talk about smart cities now, it is a lot about data-centric. So what are we going to do with all of this data that we have? How can we positively impact the life of a citizen? And then it is a lot more citizen-centric. You will hear a lot more engaging with the citizens, whether it's through online payments, whether it's through online tax collection, it is through online services that you can give to them. And online, it doesn't just mean on your desktop or on your mobile phone. Online is also using Alexa. I mean, here, state of Georgia, they have built 70 plus skills on Alexa. You can simply say, hey, Alexa, ask Georgia Gov, how do I transfer my out-of-state attorney's license? And Alexa will walk you through the process of that. That to me is making government operations, making government services smarter is a big step forward for making the government, the region, the city, the community much more smarter. I think assets will happen, connecting street lights, connecting parking spots, connecting buses. It's happening in parallel, but we don't want to forget the base of the government that needs to get smarter. And I think cloud and sensors and 5G is just accelerating because it's bringing down the barriers almost down to the floor.
Hardik, you asked, what are we going to do with the data? But, one of the big questions that's really growing in importance, I think people are getting more and more anxious about it, is really who owns your data and who controls the data. This is becoming more and more of an issue. You mentioned Alexa. There are a lot of cases now that, Alexa's listening to what you're saying.
Not if you turn it off.
Well, turn it completely off. Yeah, right. When you have data collection, I mean, everything depends on data. Are the private companies who are collecting data in a city, do they make that data available to city authorities? And if they do, is privacy being respected, et cetera? This is one of the big looming issues that I think we, as societies, we haven't really gotten our heads around yet. So that's something perhaps I would like to open this up to questioning in a little bit, but that's...
Should I quickly, on that point, just a quick one.
Yeah.
So I think it is, if you go back to when we start using credit cards, we did not know that, where we spend our money can easily be tracked where we have been. But that we have accepted that as a convenience and we use that. I think same thing with my iPhone, the location's always on. I mean, it's good thing my kids, I can always find them where they are, so they are always just a phone call away from me or to someone that can take care of them. I think the same thing applies to, as technology kind of starts becoming more and more convenient, it is important to understand what are the things that we need to be careful of the information that we are giving off ourselves, and just to be educated and make educated decisions about those things, because convenience and privacy are kind of generally in conflict. We need to figure out how can they work together.
True, but in Los Angeles, for example, there's a huge battle royale between, for example, the city and Uber. Uber collects enormous amounts of data on where we go, when we go, what are sort of optimum transit patterns, etc. The city would like that data, if only to say Uber, Lyft, Bird, whatever, avoid 3rd Street later in the day because there's going to be a demonstration or something like that. So this is kind of real time. And it's companies are really fighting back. So I'm not sure where that's going to go, because for the sort of optimal and efficient operations of a city, you do need that sort of interchange and data sharing. I want to turn to Adam Beck, who's here all the way from Brisbane, Australia, which is very, very far away indeed. Adam, you're the Executive Director of the Australia-New Zealand Smart Cities Council, but you've also done a lot of work here in this country, particularly up in Portland with Eco Districts, which is a wonderful institution. Tell us a little bit, I guess, from your point of view from down under. I mean, how are some of these issues resonating? Australia is actually known for some of its great cities. They're terrific places. I think they tend to be quite well governed. But please.
Thank you, John. And Australia is far away, but it depends on how you look at the map, of course, right? So, and thank you, Deborah and Claire, for having me here. You know, Australia, a delegation went to Barcelona from Australia a couple of years back because we didn't know where we were globally on the smart cities thing. And there was 30 of us that bundled up and we flew over to Barcelona and we came home and we debriefed and we thought, you know, we're doing some pretty good things. And the Australia, New Zealand, but also the Southeast Asia, ASEAN region is a really interesting sort of hot spot at the moment. I was just going back through the chronological order, you know, White House Smart Cities Challenge 2015, 100 Smart Cities, India 2016, Australia launched its Smart Cities Plan June 2016. Little old New Zealand went before all of those nations very quietly, way down under. And if there's anything I can do sort of in a few short moments is really sort of do some name dropping and city dropping so that you can share and learn and get in touch with these people, because that's the real fun in this smart cities agenda, just learning from each other. It's crazy exciting. The city of Christchurch in New Zealand, for those that don't know Christchurch, that's the city that suffered an extreme shock just over 10 years ago with a massive earthquake where the city essentially lifted 2 meters and went to the left 2 meters and then dropped back down again. And at one point in time, it was the largest construction project on Earth because they had to demolish the entire city. They've been rebuilding it from the ground up. It's now the most densest sensed city on Earth, and there's some amazing IoT work that's going on in Christchurch. Not far from Christchurch is Wellington in New Zealand. Probably one of the most, I like to use the word beautiful at times with smart cities. It's one of the most beautiful sort of approaches to smart cities that I've ever seen. It is purely through a human and social lens. And it's probably because the smart cities function of the city comes out of the human services department. So,
give us an example of that. I mean, in Wellington.
Well, in Wellington, the city sort of said, well, what can we influence? You know, what do we have control over? Where is our budget? Public realm is a big part of that. So they sort of look at sort of simple things, but really impactful things like, you know, where are people hurting and injuring themselves? So they look at sort of playing around with overlaying data sets, and it turns out that sort of, you know, I'm totally making this up, but for effect, you know, 1 out of, you know, 5 broken arms in this part of the city, they can determine that it's due to that sort of that last step on the bottom of the stairs that comes down from the stadium, because they were able to overlay police data, hospital data, you know, where their asset register was and where they're putting work in. Likewise, they had issues of open space and kids and nightclub venues and broken glass, using sensors for noise and alerts, just a whole range of beautiful applications of technology and data purely to just make lives better for people. And I love it and can connect you more with them. Australia, we've almost spent our $50 million. There's a program called the Smart Cities and Suburbs program that really kicked off in early 2017. In 2016, when we launched the plan in Australia, I probably could have counted on 1, maybe 2 hands the number of cities that were doing smart cities. I'd sort of define doing smart cities as there's kind of a plan, there's kind of a person, and there's a bit of pilot money being used. But with the $50 million match-for-match program that our federal government put in, we've got around about 140, 150 odd cities, all different shapes and sizes, teaming up with the private sector to pilot a whole range of smart city and data technologies. And the list is all on the website, Smart Cities and Suburbs Program. The interesting thing will be whether, once the sugar hit is gone of $50 million, whether we can sustain. And I think globally that's the biggest challenge we all have, not one-off fantastic pilots, but replicating and scaling. So Australia's been doing some great work. Sunshine Coast, City of the Sunshine Coast, north of Brisbane, an hour, probably one of our national leaders. Also City of Adelaide, automotive industry gone, back up against a wall. How do you economically sort of recharge yourself? They've gone for a 10 gig city project, essentially taking the CBD off the internet and giving its own internet to really trying to attract those next generation of businesses, movie making, e-health, things like that. And for me, one of the really exciting ones is emerging in the ASEAN region, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Think of Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand. There's some big hotspots on Earth where things are going to grow. Africa, of course. Yes, India, but Southeast Asia is a major one. And fundamental services lacking in so many parts, but some of the most amazing work being done as well. The ASEAN is the organisation of sort of 10 odd countries. They came together and they launched the ASEAN Smart Cities Network. Think of a bit of a mashup between Rockefeller 100 RC and Smart Cities, where they essentially got nominations of sort of 2 cities, 2 chief smart cities officers in each of their nations. And they spent the first year on governance. How do they effectively do smart cities as an entire region? Really exciting. They now moved, the chairship has moved from Singapore to Thailand at the moment, so they've got an issue of maintaining that momentum. Singapore, of course, smart nation model, really did a great job in kickstarting that, but we're very excited about what we're seeing in, say, Southeast Asia, because I think there's some leapfrogging to be had there. I was out in the city of Kauai, an hour north flight of Manila. Think corn and rice, very rural villages. The power of some simple solar-powered IoT solutions out there fundamentally change entire value chains and entire villages and lives and things like that. So the social impact and the economic benefit of smart city technology and data solutions in some of those places throughout Southeast Asia that have never seen some of these, that they're actually going to probably leapfrog us. They're hungry, they've got an appetite for transformation, and we've all gone forward to test a lot of these things, and they're ready there to sort of pick up and embrace. So it's a really exciting time in that entire region to be learning and networking, and I'd love to connect anyone in this room with anything that's going on there where I can.
Interesting, but there's so many apples and oranges in Southeast Asia. I mean, you have, this big, rich, top-down city-state like Singapore, and then you have, Indonesian cities, which are sort of at the other end of the spectrum, and Australia, et cetera. I mean, I guess it's...
Yeah, I certainly view the smart cities agenda as scale neutral and geography neutral. So it doesn't matter whether you're big, small, or in between. I think what we're seeing, particularly in Southeast Asia, is that it comes down to political leadership as well. So Mayor Bernard of the city of Kauai, no one's ever heard of the city of Kauai. It's in the middle of nowhere. Yet Mayor Bernard is considered the smart cities rock star of the Philippines. So political leadership, you got political leadership. You can go anywhere.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'd like to open this up to kind of just some questions from the floor. So please don't be shy. And if you ask a question, please identify yourselves beforehand. Perhaps up there, this gentleman. Up.
I don't need a microphone.
Oh, you have a loud voice.
Loud voice. Sean Aurora, I'm with Tech.
Yeah.
Jason, the topic of Miami came up, so sure, let's talk about Miami. How do you make the city smart that might not be smart to be where you are anymore?
Yeah, I think that's a journey. So one of the things that we've tried to do is to catalyze urban resilience and shape some of this thinking. The first thing that we did is to help the cities install a chief resilience officer. So there's a badge city employee inside City Hall, part of the executive team, so not in the basement someplace, somebody who has the ability to carry this topic and to work collaboratively across the different agencies to advance the discussion. And then to help with that, the other thing we do is help cities like Atlanta develop a comprehensive resilience strategy. So earlier in my conversation, to understand what are those specific shocks and stresses that your city is susceptible to, so you can help prioritize them. And so if you go to a Miami, obviously Miami has challenges with climate change and flooding. This is a process to help advance that conversation and not just have a few people, but have the larger community and the stakeholders brought into it. And then the next part of that is to look at what are some specific initiatives that you can put in place to help address those shocks or stresses. So in the case of Miami, we've been doing a number of accelerators working with folks to take some of the areas that are most susceptible to either sea rise or flooding, and to look at different strategies that they can put in place. And so that's part of the process we've been working through to help with that. So there's no easy answer. Obviously, it's a massive problem, but part of it is getting it prioritized, getting everyone aware of it, and then finding those things that you can do to move forward with it. Does that help? Any thoughts on that? You want more?
Well, don't be shy, sir.
How do you take the application, let's say, remember what you did, when you're networking with technology, you're creating an extension of the city service. But what do you do when you're trying to reach a consensus about what you're going to do around an infrastructure project in a city? In Atlanta, it's what do we do around the airport to make it economic development? What do we do around the Beltline for affordable housing? Reaching a consensus with those people that you communicate. How do you do that? Because it's very hard to do even in person, much less through technology.
Who wants to have a stab at that?
I'll take a shot.
Okay.
One of the things that we found as a challenge initially and resistance to a lot of projects that we were trying to put in place was basically around communication, public engagement, helping the citizens appreciate the need and the impact of the projects that we were doing, and then being able to adopt them and also benefit from them. And we did that through, as I said initially, we did a lot of communication, public engagement, public meetings on site, but also using the radio programs, call-in programs, TV programs, but mostly the social media platform, because the urban residents have access to social media. So we used the different platforms, basic Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and all the rest, to engage the public and keep them informed of what was coming. And then using members of the public to speak for the projects. I want to give you an example of one of the places where we're building a major road infrastructure. This project was going to impact on people's houses. It was going to impact on the environment because of the dust and all during the implementation, inconvenience, traffic. But we engaged the public and started to tell them what benefits would come out of this project using all these different platforms. And the public was able to take interest. And then we started calling upon members of the public to come and get low-income jobs. We engaged the contractor and was able to hire them. So they got engaged. Some got jobs. Some did businesses with the teams that were working on site. And eventually, when we finished the project, the public beneficiaries were able to speak for the project. The land value went up. The environment in terms of sanitation went up. Mobility went up. Businesses went up. So we used those kinds of benefits to promote the next project and the next project. And eventually, the public was very appreciative and engaged in the various projects. I don't know if that helps.
I think it's exactly that. Do you see what the mayor did? She stepped up for the panel, she took control, and she answered the question. And I think if you look at cities around the world, those that are making progress on these tough decisions are ones that have strong executives that are willing to help lead their cities and help navigate some of the governance issues. I think Peter and others mentioned that as we move into this new era, things that were siloed now come together. And unless you've got an executive that can get their team working together, it's really hard to make things happen. I think that's why some of the people, particularly from the private sector, that are trying to work with cities, look at cities like maybe like a New York. That's just so complex. It's really hard to do things at scale simply because each one of these agencies is its own city in itself. But I do think that executive control is really important.
An example I can...
No, go ahead,
Short
Hardik.
example. So from my hometown, Chicago. So I was not with Chicago at that time. So University of Chicago and the City of Chicago were working together for the project called Array of Things, which was basically putting multi-node sensors on multiple streetlights to collect data around noise, pollution, traffic patterns, pedestrian patterns. And there was a huge issue basically following a Chicago Tribune article about the data privacy and what's going to happen with all of the data that's going to get collected. And the project was basically stopped, and the city and university worked together to hold multiple town hall meetings across the city of Chicago, got a lot of input from the citizens, concerned citizens that they wanted to get engaged, and that culminated into what they call the Citizen Bill of Rights for Privacy. And that basically defined what kind of data is going to be captured, how it will be anonymized, if not anonymized already, where it will be stored and how it will be used, all of that, and then what was posted on the University of Chicago's Array of Things project website. So that kind of an example where it requires cities to listen and then act, and then basically it doesn't need to be, they don't need to rush into something, or they don't need to block the pushback that comes. So that's a very good example of how kind of Chicago stepped back, and it took them 2 years to get back on track, but they waited for that.
Just 1 second. I want to go back to one thing that you said, and that is about having a strong executive. But Hardik, going to that point, you have cities in the United States that have very different governance systems. I mean, forget about the international scene. But if you take, the New York mayor, for example, is a strong executive. I mean, structurally, I mean, he or she is mayor of 5 boroughs. It's a kind of unified area, et cetera. If you go in the other extreme, the mayor of Los Angeles is very weak. There are 88 municipalities in Los Angeles County, and LA City is only one of them. And so figuring that out is very, very complicated. So you cannot structurally have a strong executive in a place like Los Angeles. In your work, how do you see sort of things like that? Is that you're selling to city governments, aren't you?
Yeah, no, it is definitely. I mean, all cities in the U.S. have different structures: weak council, strong mayor, strong council, weak mayor. The one that I worked for was a strong mayor daily, so it was easier to get stuff done through the city council, the right things. The governor that I worked for was a Republican governor with the Democratic supermajority in both houses, in both chambers of the Senate and House. So it was a lot more conciliation, like working with the Senate, working with the House, working with the representatives, working with lots of kind of aspects of people, and then convincing them. I think, again, going back to a lot of us are in the private sector, and you don't start a project without looking at the benefits that you're going to derive from it. In the case of the government, it is the ROI is around citizen benefits, it's around reduced cost, it's around increased revenue, it's around multiple other things. And to me, anytime a city starts a project without looking at a very clear ROI and having the calculation and then working backwards, you're going to hit some kind of a block. But if you have a very clear ROI calculation, even Cisco and Amazon, I don't get a dime from the company to invest in if I don't show the ROI. And in Amazon, it's all about starting with the customer and working backwards. As long as it is beneficial to the customers, we do the project. I mean, I think those projects that are done that way, you'll find less opposition that have a lot of thought that has gone in the beginning.
Right.
I have a question related to the 100 resilient cities and the kind of international.
Identifying yourself. Yeah.
Oh yeah, my name is Iris Tien. I'm a faculty member in civil and environmental engineering here at Georgia Tech, and I actually worked on the City of Atlanta resilience strategy. And my question is related to it's my understanding that 100 resilient cities is going away, and kind of one of the things that I thought was really good about it is the platform to share across multiple cities, so we're not kind of reinventing solutions every time. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what are the best ways to share best practices across cities, especially given the international nature of this panel.
Absolutely. So for those that don't know, yes, 100 Resilient Cities is going to close at the end of July. We will have completed, I think, 97 of the 100 strategies. And what the foundation wants to do is really focus on action. And instead of trying to do that in 100 cities, what they're going to do is create a new partnership with the Atlantic Council to pick more like a handful of cities that they can do a deeper dive in and try and move some of those tough infrastructure projects in places like Miami or elsewhere instead of just kind of having to go all over the place. But one of the great things that we did was we built this network of CROs in 100 cities. And what we found is peer-to-peer collaboration was a very powerful tool. And certainly there's other examples of that. Deb Soch is here, Next Century Cities. You've built an amazing network of broadband enthusiasts across the country who are championing community-based broadband. There's the Bloomberg Network. There's a whole bunch of folks who are trying to help foster those collaborations. So even though we're going away, that collaboration won't stop. Does that answer your...
If I could add to that, Smart Cities Council does a lot in terms of, just putting a plug for you, Adam, in terms of making sure that everyone who does work with Smart Cities Council, all of their projects are listed up there. There are also projects that have been done by other cities, like the city of Louisville for traffic analysis. It was built using open source code. It's available on GitHub. So any city can basically download that code and get up and running. There are many marketplaces that are coming up. So I think to a lot of extent, most of our cities, 80% of the things that we do are the same. So we should rather look for those copy, paste, copy, configure, as opposed to everything has to start from ground zero.
So fully agree. My question is really on that point on replication. So we've talked about leadership being really important. We've talked about talking about outcomes being really important. I think the point that was made about peer-to-peer learning and visibility and validation is really important. From your perspective, being global, looking across, what are some of the things that you see are really essential to being able to replicate a solution from one city into another? What are the parallels that are most important to be able to pick something up and drop it into another city from your perspective? Oh,
Sure.
and I'm Elle from the Atlas.
I can start, and I think we'd love to hear from Kampala. It's like how they started their journey, because I'm sure their starting point is different than many other cities. But I think what we have seen is obviously leadership comes at the very front. You need to have the right leadership. The other thing that we have also seen is you need to have defined priorities. Like, what is it that you're trying to do becoming a smart city? It's not like, I want to have street lights connected. I mean, that's not the end all be all. That is number two. Number three is what are the benefits that you're going to derive? Who's going to get those benefits? Once you have those three kind of defined, when I worked with the state of Illinois 2.5 years, 2 out of those 2.5 years, we didn't have an approved budget from the Senate and the House. Those that follow Illinois, how difficult it is. But we found money. We found 90% of the budget was still approved, coming from various sources. So those cities that say, funding is the biggest problem, I would say, look back. There is so much money there that you can find. And lastly, I would say, you cannot sustain a smart city if you don't have the right kind of people, trained and ready, skilled and everything. So as much as you want to deploy all of these things, you also need to invest in a lot of focus and energy and resources in reskilling your people, as well as reskilling the people general in the economy that you have. I think that, to me, if you take your eye off of the economic ball, then you'll have just great shiny objects, but nothing to show in the economy. I think those are the kind of things that we have, and we work with at Amazon, we work with identifying key customers who have kind of they're looking at technology, services, operations, and economy, all kind of transformation. To me, that's the secret sauce of becoming a smarter, having a strategy like that. And that, to me, once you have that, it's easy to copy-paste things.
Talking too much about one thing. So first of all, does everyone know Atlas Marketplace, doing an amazing job of helping to promote vendor community and procurement and all of that? But the example I would love to give you is the Smart Cities mission in India. So they went out of the gate after Modi launched it, picked 100 cities, they picked projects, they installed every city with a consultant. Kunal Kumar, who's the new minister, inherited all of this and is trying to figure out how to help make all of these projects as successful as he can. So one of the things is he's doing, he's working with the National Institute for Urban Affairs, and they're building a national data observatory so they can do some of that standardization. So say you are the city of Chennai and you're wrestling with flooding. What are the 5-10 data sets that you need to fully understand what your risk is or how to prepare, how to respond? And can they standardize that? Peter showed some systems thinking. Part of this is thinking about systems. What are the business processes? And then how do we standardize those so that you can replicate them? So this might be a good example of an organization that's trying to do just that against very specific use cases.
I just wanted to give an example from, again, Kampala. Where did we start? We started, as I said, by looking at the needs of the citizens, but also realizing that in the developing country context, there are a lot of vendors, technology vendors, trying to push solutions. So as a leader, also just to disclaim, I was not the mayor, I was the city executive director, that is the CEO, chief executive of the city. Ours is a system where the executive powers and all the financial leadership and everything is in the executive director. The mayor is mostly ceremonial. Yeah, that's why I'm not a mayor. In our context. So the vendors are trying to push technology. They are trying to make a sale. So as a leader with limited resources, I had to ask the difficult questions. The technology you're trying to sell to us, show us an example of where it has worked, what have been the results, where are the benefits to the citizens. And if the vendor cannot convince me of that, then I'm not interested. Also, whatever technology you give to us has got to be sustainable. It's got to be technology that we can adjust to meet the context. It has to be technology that we can develop. These young, educated, very inspired young people can work with, develop, and take to the next level. So once we found a vendor who was able to take those conditions, we decided to prioritize the investment. Now, if you're collecting $8 million US equivalent annually, and you're trying to purchase a system which is going to cost you $2 million, it's a very, very tough negotiation to get the different financing authorities in government to approve. But we had to persuade them and show them that the return on investment was immense. And looking back now, that investment of $2 million US, growing up to return of $22 million US was worth the decision. So taking all those into consideration, we're able to build a technology that was appropriate, that was sustainable, and that is available to the point that these young people that built the initial system are now lending their capacity to other urban authorities within and outside Uganda and helping them build their own systems at a much lower cost, and therefore supporting the South-to-South cooperation. And what we're telling them, you can do it as an urban city. We have done it before, and they're taking those examples.
Can I just pick up on the word finance? Of course. Which we don't talk enough about when we talk about smart cities. If we're going to win this, We've got to not only scale but replicate and do it rapidly because we're on the clock with climate change and a whole range of other things. We ran a Smart Cities Investment Forum in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and it fundamentally highlighted this super wicked problem that we have. I don't think it's unique to Australia. I'd be confident in saying it's pretty much global, is that cities need access to capital. I don't know any city that doesn't aspire to creatively find ways to leverage more private sector capital. And of course, their budgets aren't tripling every year, right? Money's becoming tighter. Yet globally, we've got more money than we've ever had, and it's cheaper than it's ever been. Right? So we have this really wicked problem. We had some banks at this investment forum. They're not getting out of bed for anything less than 150 million, right? They got plenty of money. There are mountains of money that the investment community want to park into really good things that make cities better. And we've got heaps of cities that need to make their cities better. So the minimum spend is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And my assessment, very crudely, on average, is the sort of the average smart city kind of solution project program is like maybe 300K to maybe 1.5 million. They're not getting out of bed that anything less than 150 million. If you can get up there, the gold is there. So we globally have a really important challenge to come together, aggregate demand, and scale and replicate, because it becomes win-win-win. We get to deploy, we build better cities. I mean, he wants terabytes, not sort of megabytes, right? So everyone wins if we scale, and the money's there if we can scale. So we don't talk about finance enough and how we're going to be able to attract that capital.
So it's a great segue to my question. So most of the problems that are facing smart cities are regional. Greg Laudeman, by the way, with Magellan Advisors, we're building smart cities out there, and yet cities have challenges just interconnecting their sites and breaking down their own silos, and then you mix in multiple cities, some of which are basically kind of losing out. So, for example, the vast majority of jobs in Georgia were created in Atlanta, yet a lot of those folks live out in the suburbs. So do you see best practices for regions coming together for smart solutions? And what would you say are some rules of thumb or things that you'd suggest regions do to address some of these issues?
Who wants to stab at that?
No, I'll take that one.
Yeah.
Talking about finance, talking about regional problems, what we've experienced is the private sector, public sector partnerships have been really effective. We talk about, one of the big problems that's happening is urban density. It's said by 2050, 80%, two-thirds of the world's population will reside in cities consuming 75% of the world's resources, producing 80% of the world's GDP. But as they do that, the jobs are changing. The level of education that's required is changing. The use and implementation of technology is changing. So how do we prepare the citizens to participate in this new world? And we're finding that partnerships with, again, private companies that are pioneering these new technologies. You think about autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles. People are attacking some of these problems through the air. You're going to see air taxis and hyperloops and underground tunnels. And how do we prepare a whole new workforce? We call it the workforce of the future. And so preparing a whole new set of engineers that are going to work on these problems, that are going to participate in this. And also, as you shift the population centers in and you change that educational model, you have to change the paradigm. So, providing software, providing infrastructure, from the private sector has addressed some of these finance problems that we've seen. So we take the state of South Carolina, for example, big initiatives there, state of Indiana, as they try to revitalize the manufacturing sector We look at, the Indiana Manufacturing Institute and others that we have partnerships with. So I think that private sector, public sector partnership is a way to address not only the financing problem, but also preparing the citizenry for this whole new set of technology, new jobs that are coming.
So I'll give you 3 examples, and I'm on the clock. One is look out in Phoenix with what's happening with ASU and the 22 municipalities in the Phoenix region. They are coming up with great answers, good answers, or answers. You figure out whether it's good, great, or bad. Number 2 is the Greater Washington, D.C. metro region. So the Greater Washington Board of Trade is building a smart region movement for the Northern Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. region. And they're head-on tackling procurement pooling, funding pooling, administration, governance. So we'll get some answers. And the third one, I won't give you. Ask Deborah how they're doing with Georgia and Georgia Tech and how that's happening. So there are things are happening. I think in the next couple of years we'll have those answers.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much.
Well done, John.
So we're going to head into what we think to be a very exciting point. We're going to head into what we think is a very exciting point. We have a number of professors here, and they can really command the classroom, and I don't necessarily have that, so I will defer. But here's what we're going to do next, guys. There are drinks and refreshments and a lot of sugar that's outside to my right. And you're welcome to, and I also see there's ice cream. So there's like some really good refreshments. Bathrooms are across the hall. But what we're going to do next is really demonstrate research in action. Now, I would tell you that it would have been a lot easier if Claire and I just formed another panel. Very easy to do that. The extent of what we've been able to do is really to demonstrate what we've been saying throughout the morning and afternoon, which is research and action. And Jason alluded it to a little bit about why a university is so great in terms of the longevity, in terms of being an important stakeholder and partner to the whole smart city space. But the other thing that really attracted me personally to a university is the innovative research, the bleeding edge research that's happening day in and day out, and how it's being translated across the board in terms of how we are educating our future leaders, how we are making an impact into the communities, and how that information is actually being disseminated across the board. And what we've come up here today to showcase is this is why this is not a typical academic convening. This is why this is not a typical Smart Cities conference or event. Because what we want to do is to put you into 5 different research tracks. Now, when each of you signed up to look at 5 different multidisciplinary research tracks in action. And this really imposes us to actually leave the classroom and go into Georgia Tech campus and actually connect with one of the world's leading experts, practitioners, and educators in this space. I won't go into too much detail on each of these tracks because your booklets actually give you a pretty good overview of the tracks. But what I wanted to share, and Dennis actually challenged me this in the planning session, is what makes Georgia Tech special. If I really had to talk about smart city space, and you can tell by the caliber of the audience here and the caliber of the panel here across the board, this is not a Smart Cities 101. We are really moving beyond that in terms of what is the cutting edge, interesting complexities in terms of putting smart cities on the ground. And these were specifically the curated tracks that we chose. Notice that each of them are not your traditional verticals. For Georgia Tech, they don't live in any one college or school or discipline. And they're very much multidisciplinary engagements that forces professors across the board to work together in ways that are different. They don't follow that traditional grant or classroom type setting. And so you're really going to get a special treat here today because we've never done this at Georgia Tech to show this level of research across the board and really force us to demonstrate it, to show you what we're thinking about and how we're doing it and how we're tackling technology and data and people and really putting equity in place and really putting virtual built environments and robotics and AI and empowering people to think about data and analytics differently and really thinking about how it creates economic development and economic revitalization. So there's going to be a mix of questions throughout the board. And what we're going to do is have you divide into the 5 groups, and I'll explain that later. But then each of your groups will then reconvene at the Renaissance for our evening reception at the Renaissance Hotel rooftop, and then we'll have an evening dinner panel to go through it. And then the next morning, we'll have our track leaders come back for a morning panel to kind of go through the tracks. So you really hear the lessons learned and the discussions throughout the afternoon translated into the evenings. And even if you miss the track, the other 4 tracks, because you're going on a deeper dive on this track, you'll hear that panel. So with that, I'll give you some very brief instructions to see how we can seamlessly leave this classroom and really go into the demonstration. Each of our track leaders has a very nice card that shows you what the 5 tracks are. There are 2 tracks that require a trolley service to get into campus. So for those 2 tracks, I ask the attendees to stay in this room. All right, so the 2 tracks are the digital twin, led by Professor John Taylor, and robotics, led by Professor Seth Hutchinson. So those 2 tracks, please stay in this room, and then we will escort you out with our Georgia Tech trolley to take you to campus. The other 3 tracks, inclusive engagement, led by Professor Ellen Zagura, Resilient Spaces, led by Shane Aurora, and then Innovation District, led by Greg King and Mary Hunter, will be walk-in. And so I ask you to follow them outside this room, and they will lead you to their spaces. Now, of course, in this interim, please feel free to use the restroom, and please get ice cream and refreshments and whatever you need. But please pay attention to who your track leaders are. And then I will see you all at the Renaissance tonight at 5:30. Yes, you can talk to them when you do that. All right, so thank you so much.